The pattern drafting and sewing tutorial for this A-Line Kurti with collar, puffy sleeve, side pocket and a front slit is a highly requested video, so I'm not going to talk much. Let's get into it. I will divide this video into two sessions. The first session will be the drafting process, then the second session will be the cutting and stitching of the A-Line Kurti. You will need your basic pattern drafting tools, then a sewing machine, then the fabric you use. This is the measurement you require. I'll pop the measurements on the screen so that if you need, you can pause it and then take the necessary measurement you require. I'll start by drawing a straight line at the top edge of the paper, which I'll use as my shoulder guideline. Then from the shoulder guideline, I'll square a line down the length of the paper, which I'll use as my center back line. I'm drafting the back pattern first before we draft the front. Now on the shoulder guideline, measure and mark half of your across shoulder measurement. Mine is 7 inches. So from the center back line, I'll measure and mark 7 inches on the shoulder guideline, just like so. Now from that mark, I'll go down by 1 inch to create the shoulder slope mark, just like so. So on the shoulder guideline, we need to input our neck width measurement. So measuring from the center back line, measure and mark your neck width measurement, which in this case I'm using 3 inches. So I'll measure and mark 3 inches on the shoulder guideline like so. Now we need the depth of our back neck. So measuring from the shoulder line, measure down on the center back line your back neck depth measurements, which in this case I'm just using 1 inch. So I'll measure and mark 1 inch. Then I'll join the neck depth to the neck width with a curve to create the back neck curve like so. Join the tip of the neck to the shoulder slope mark to create the shoulder line, just like so. Now we need our armhole. So measuring from the shoulder slope line, measure and mark half your armhole circumference measurement, which in this case mine is 7 inches, but I'm adding half inch for ease. Since this is a free dress, I will be adding ease to all the measurements. So I'll measure and mark 7.5 like so. So to get a straight line for the armhole, I'm going to measure and mark from the center back line 7 inches and mark like so. Now I'll join these 2 points to create the back armhole line. Now where 7.5 inches mark ended, square a line out to create the chest line, just like so. So now on the chest line, measure and mark 1/4 of your back circumference measurement plus 0.5 inch ease. On the armhole line, look for the midpoint and make a mark like so. Now using your curve ruler, join these points to create the armhole curve. If you don't have a curve ruler, you can measure from the corner diagonally 1 inch and mark, then connect the points to get the curve. But I'm going to use my curve ruler to do that since I have one. Now we need our waistline. So measuring from the shoulder, measure and mark your shoulder to waist length measurement, which in this case I'm using 14.5 inches. So I'll measure and mark 14.5 inches, just like so. Square a line out to use as your waist guideline. Now on the waist guideline, input 1/4 of your waist circumference plus 0.5 inches of ease and mark. Now we need our hip guideline. So measuring from the shoulder, measure and mark your shoulder to hip or waist to hip measurement, which in this case I'm using 21 inches. So I'll measure and mark 21 inches like so. Square a line out on this mark to create the hip guideline. For the hip line, we don't really need it since this is an A-line dress, and therefore we are not really going to use the hip line. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to go ahead and then draw the line. Now let's move to the hem. Since we don't really need the hip circumference measurement, we are not going to input, but if you want, you can still input your hip circumference measurement, but you are not really going to use it. So if you want to input your hip circumference measurement, just measure and mark 1/4 of your hip circumference measurement plus 0.5 inches ease, just like you did for the waist and the chest. Now let's move to the hem side. So for the hem, we are going to input the length of the kurti. So measuring from the shoulder, measure and mark the length you want for your kurti. In this case, I'm just using 37 inches. So if you want more length, just add the amount of length you want. My paper is just 28, so I'm just going to use 27. Then I'll use the 1 inch that is left for my hem allowance. So now square a line out on the mark you've just made to create the hem guideline. Now on the hem guideline, measure and mark your hip circumference measurement. Then add the amount of flare you want for this dress. So in this case, since I'm using 8.5 inches for the hip, I'm going to use 14 inches. That's I'm adding 5.5 inches to the hem to create the flare for the kurti, or the A-line effect for the kurti. So now join the mark on the hem to the mark on the waist to create the side seam for your kurti. Since my ruler is not long enough, I'm just going to use my measuring tape as a ruler. As you can see, the line did not really pass through the hip circumference measurement we input on the hip line. So that's why I was saying that the hip measurement is not really needed in this tutorial. You only need it for the hem, then you know how much you want to add to the hip to get the flare you want, but you don't really need it on the hip line. Then join the waistline to the chest line to create the side seam for the upper part. Be sure to blend all sharp corners. Now our kurti is almost done. What is left is to curve the hem side of our dress. So to do that, we are going to measure from the shoulder the length of the dress. Because of the flare we have here, the side seam hem side of the dress is going to be longer than the center hem side of the dress. So to get an equal hem line, we need to measure from the tip of the shoulder the length of the kurti. So in this case, the length is 37. So I'll measure from the tip of the shoulder down to the hem of the kurti, 38 inches. Keep the measuring tape at the shoulder and move the measuring tape to the side seam. Wherever the 37 inches mark hit on the side seam is the true hem line at the side seam. So mark that place and join it back to the hem line to create the actual hem for the side seam. As you can see, the measurements have lifted about 1 inch. Now blend this mark back onto the hem line, create the actual hem for the kurti. So I'm going to use my curved ruler to do this. Now we need our pocket. So we are going to measure from the waist down 2 inches on the side seam, just like so, and mark. Now from that mark, just place your hand like you're putting your hand in your pocket. Then trace the outline to create the pocket, just like so. This is one of the tricks to get pockets without stress. If you want your pocket bigger, just spread your hands. If you want it smaller, bring your hands closer. As you can see, my hands can easily enter the pocket in and out without stress. Now we need to add the necessary seam allowance we need for this. So I'm just going to add 1/2 inch all through. Then I'll add 1 inch to the hem. So the only difference is the hem that I'm adding 1 inch. The rest I'm adding 1/2 inch all around the pattern to create the side seam for the A-line kurti. Join the points to create the seam allowance lines, just like so. Now the back part of our pattern is ready. Go ahead and label it with the pattern name and cutting instruction. Then cut your pattern out. Now we are going to use this same pattern to trace the front of the kurti. Then we will just alter the neckline and then the armhole. So that's what we are going to do now. So I'm going to go ahead and trace the whole pattern onto a fresh sheet of paper, just like so. I traced the pattern and left the neckline and then the armhole because that's what we need to alter. So now I'm going to draw the front neck for the front. So in this case, the depth I want is 3 inches and the width is the same as the back, which is 3 inches. So I'm going to measure and mark 3 inches, create the front neck curve, just like so. Now on the shoulder guideline, measure and mark the half the across shoulder measurement, which was 7 inches. So we are just confirming the measurements to make sure that everything is, we've actually transferred the same measurements we need. So mark like so. Now from that mark, confirm your armhole length, which in this case is 7.5. So measure and mark 7.5. Then draw the chest guideline, just like so. Now on the chest guideline, measure and mark your across, half your across shoulder measurement again to get a straight line down to create the armhole for the front. So join this mark to the shoulder slope line to create the armhole line, just like so. Now look for the midpoint point of the armhole line, then go in by 1/2 inch. Now on the chest line, input 1/4 of your bust circumference measurement plus 0.5 inches of ease. Now join this mark to the 1/2 inch mark, then to the tip of the shoulder or the shoulder slope mark, just like so, to create the armhole for the front. Now since we already have seam allowance in the old pattern that we traced, the only seam allowance we now need is for the armhole and then the neckline. So add 1/2 inch seam allowance to the neckline, then the armhole. Now since this kurti have a slit in the front, we need to make allowance for that. So we are going to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to the center front line to be able to create the slit for the front. So I'm measuring from the center front line. I'll measure out 1/2 inch, then draw a straight line down to the length of the dress to later use for our slit. Now I'm just going ahead to transfer all the marks. You don't need to do that, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to transfer everything so that you get the idea clearly. Now the front part of our kurti is also ready. Go ahead and label the pattern with your pattern name and cutting instructions. Then cut your pattern out. Now, to create the slit for the dress, we need a strip. So, measure from the neck down to the full length of the dress. In this case, when I measured from the tip of the neck, that's the depth of the neck, to the hem of the dress, I got 35.5 inches. So, I'm going to use this measurement to cut 2 strips. So the length of the strip is going to be 35.5 inches. Then the width of the strip will be 3 inches for one, then 2 inches for another one. So we need 2 strips, 2 inches by 35.5, then 3 inches by 35.5. Use your measurement because this is what I got for this dress. So if your dress is longer than this one, you have a different measurement. So this is what we are going to use the strip for. You get the idea when we start sewing this pattern together. Now what we are going to do is to draft the collar for the kurti. So to do that, we will measure the neckline for both the front and the back. So you have to measure without the seam allowance. So measure on the actual neck measurement or the actual neckline. So for the back neckline, I got 3/3/8 of an inch. And for the front, I got 4/5/8 of an inch. So in total, so when I added the 2 necklines together, I got 8 inches. Then I'll add 1 inch to the 8 inches to make 9 inches. This 1 inch extra I'm adding is because of the strip I'll be adding to the center front. So if you don't add it, your collar is going to be short by 1 inch. Now take a fresh sheet of paper and fold it in half, just like so. Then draw a straight line to use as your start point. From this straight line, measure up 3 inches. Now on the guideline, input your back neck measurement, which in this case mine is 3/3/8 of an inch. So measure and mark this measurement on the guideline you've drawn. Then after that mark, input the front neck measurement, which in this case mine is 4/5/8 of an inch. So I'll measure and mark 4/5/8 of an inch on the guideline we've drawn, just like so. Where this mark ends, square a line out to create a rectangle. So in essence, we are just drawing a rectangle to use as a guide to draw the neck curve. Now we are going to create the curve for the neck. So using the curve side of our ruler, place it such that the curve is touching the back neck mark. Draw the collar curve, just like so. So this is what we have. Now input the width of the neck you want. I'm using 1 inch for this collar. So from this curve, measure and mark 1 inch all through, just like so, to create the collar. Join these points to create the collar, just like so. Now, on the curve you've just drawn, measure and mark the total neck measurement you got from measuring the front and back and adding together, plus the 1 inch extra you added. Measure and mark that on the second curve you've drawn, just like so. Now, create the neck design you want. So I'm just going for a curved at the center front. So I'm just going to curve it to create the design I want, just like so. Go ahead and add all the necessary seam allowance you will need for your collar. So in this case, I'm just adding 1/2 inch all through. Then cut out your pattern. Now our collar too is ready. Now we need a sleeve for the kurti. So take a fresh sheet of paper and fold it in half, just like so. Then draw a straight line at the top edge of the paper to use as your start point. Now from this line, measure and mark your cap height measurement, which in this case I'm using 3.5 inches. So measure and mark 3.5. So measure and mark yours, then square a line to create the bicep line, just like so. Now on the bicep line, measure and mark half of your bicep measurement. Measure a diagonal measurement, then measure and mark half of your armholes measurement. Thus, you measure the armhole for the front and the back, then you divide it by 2. So you are going to input that measurement on the line. So measure from the guideline to the bicep line diagonally. Input this measurement there. That's half of your armhole, front and back armhole measurement, just like so. If this mark does not touch the bicep measurement, look for the midpoint of the 2 marks. Then draw your armhole curve line to the mid of the 2 marks. Now we are going to create the sleeve curve. So first look for the midpoint of the diagonal line we've drawn. Then for the front, we are going to divide the diagonal line into 4 equal parts. So I'm going to divide it equally into 4, just like so. Since we are going to draft both the front and the back on this same side, so to create the back curve, go up on the midpoint of the diagonal line, up 1/2 inch, then draw a curve using your curve ruler. Join them the cap height mark to the bicep line to create the back armhole curve, just like so. This line we've now drawn is our back armhole curve or our back sleeve curve. So now we need to create the front sleeve curve for our dress. So now on this mark that I just touched, that's the line closer to the cap height, go up by 1/2 inch. Then the mark closer to the biceps line, go down by 1/2 inch, just like so. Join these marks to create the front curve, making sure that your ruler touches all the marks, just like so, to create the curve for the front. So now this is the curve for our front armhole. So the black line is the front and the red one that we first drew is for the back. Now we need the length of our sleeve. So measure from the tip of the shoulder or the first guideline, measure and mark the length you want for your sleeve, which in this I'm using 10 inches. So I'll measure and mark 10 inches like so. Now on the hem of the sleeve, measure and mark the measurement you are using. So if this mark is at the elbow, measure the elbow measurement, then divide it by 2 and place it on this. If this is to the biceps or if this is to the 3/4, measure where you want the sleeve to end. Measure that place, then divide the measurement into 2, then place it on this line. This sleeve is almost to the elbow, so I'll use the elbow measurement divided by 2, then place it on this. Then I'll join it to the biceps line to create the sleeve for this kurti. Since this is a free dress, make sure that all the measurements you add the necessary ease to it. So this one, I've added 1/2 inch ease to the measurement. Now go ahead and add all the necessary seam allowance you will need for this sleeve. So for the hem of the sleeve, I'm adding 1 inch. Then the rest I'm adding 1/2 inch all through. make notches on the sleeve curve for ease control. Now go ahead and cut your sleeve. Make sure that you cut the back part first before you cut the front. If you cut the front first, you spoil your sleeve because you will not be able to cut the back. Since the back is a bit higher than the front, you need to cut the back first before you cut the front. When you are cutting the hem for the sleeve, fold it like how you will sew it before you cut it. Now cut the front part of your sleeve too. If you want a basic sleeve for your dress, then you have your sleeve now. Now as basic sleeve is also ready. If you want a puffy sleeve, you can go ahead then cut and spread this sleeve to create the puffy effect. I'll go ahead and do that since that's what I want. By transferring this sleeve, or if you are not going to use the basic sleeve again, then you can slash the original sleeve. But since I'll be using this sleeve for other tutorials, I'm going to go ahead and then trace this sleeve onto a fresh sheet of paper, just like so. Now to create the puffy effect, slash the bicep line to the side seam of the sleeve, but you shouldn't cut it through. Just cut to the very edge of the side seam for the sleeve and slash from the center to the bicep to open the sleeve cap, just like so. Now take a fresh sheet of paper and place your sleeve on it, just like so. Make sure that the paper is enough to accommodate the design you want. Now I'm going to create the puffy effect. So draw a straight line from the bottom of the paper, then place the hem of your sleeve onto that line so that your sleeve will be straight down. Then open the slash lines you've made to the desired volume you want to add. So in this case, I want to add 4 inches to the height of the sleeve. So I'll measure from the bicep line, that's where I slashed, 4 inches up. Then create a line there as a guide where I will later place the 2 slash caps that I've created to match so that I'll have an equal spread all through. So now tape the slash sleeve down so that it will not move around. So now this is what we have. We've increased the height of our sleeve, then we've added volume 2 to the sleeve. This is what is going to create the puffy effect we want. Now after taping everything down, blend the cap of your sleeve, just like so. So now I've increased the volume of the cap, then I've increased the height of the cap too. So in this case, the height is now 9 inches. The original was 4 inches, so I've added 5 inches to the cap height. And the volume too, I've increased the volume of the sleeve by 7 inches. So our puffy sleeve is also ready. Since I've already added seam allowance to the original pattern, I'm not going to add any seam allowance to this pattern. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this pattern out. All the patterns we need for this kurti is ready. We have our puffy sleeve and the basic sleeve, whichever one you want. Then we have the 2 strips for the center front. Then we have our collar. Now what is left is for us to cut this pattern on a fabric to sew this pattern together. Now let's go ahead and cut our pattern on our fabric. I didn't have any fancy fabric for this video, so just bear with me. Since we've already added all the necessary seam allowance we need for this dress, we are not going to add any seam allowance, so we are just going to pin these patterns onto our fabric, then cut exactly what we have on the pattern on the fabric. So just pin your patterns onto the fabric and cut exactly what you have on the pattern on your fabric, just like so. I'll go ahead and cut all the pattern pieces off camera. So these are the pattern pieces cut on our fabric. So we have the back, which we cut on fold. Then we have the front, which we cut 2 pieces. Then we have the sleeve. I used the puffy sleeve pattern for a puffy sleeve, so I cut 2 of that for the sleeve. Then the strip, this is the 2 inches strip. Then I cut an interface, which is 1 inch for the 2 inches one. Then the second one, which is the 3 inches strip, I went ahead and cut 2 inches strip for the 3 inches. That's, I did not add any seam allowance to the strips, so that's the exact measurements we need. Then our collar, the collar I cut 2 on fold. That's 2 pairs on fold for the collar. Then I cut interface 2 for the collar. Since I don't have a collar interface, I'm going to use 2 interface for the collar so that the collar will have a bit of stability to it. So this is all the patterns we need for this video. Now we are going to assemble our fabric. So I've gone ahead and folded both the hem for the sleeve. I've ironed it in place to create a crease line, which I'll later sew to hem the sleeve. I've also ironed my interface onto the collar. Now we are going to sew the top part of our collar. That's the part that is up, not the part that is attached to the dress, but the one that will be up. So we are going to sew there using 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now we are going to work on the front part of the dress. So we are going to attach the strips to the center front of the dress. So you attach one to the left, then you attach one to the right. In this case, I'm attaching the 2 inches to the right side. That's the one that is facing you now. And the one on top, I'm adding the 3 inches strip to it. I'll use the seam allowance I added to the center front to pin the strip together. Then I'll take it to the sewing machine and attach the strips. So after attaching the strip, this is what we have. Push the seam allowance inside the strip just like so. So this is the 3 inches one. So we are going to sandwich the seam allowance into the strip. Since we've already used 1/2 inch to attach the strip to the center front, we are going to fold the other 1/2 inch inside to finish the raw edge. Then the 2 inches that is left, we will fold it in the middle to create a sandwich. So now we are pinning the strip to sandwich the center front into the fabric just like so. Take it to the sewing machine, then top stitch the strip to secure the strip onto the center front. You do the same for the 2 inches strip, but in this case you are not going to sandwich the center front into the strip, but rather you are going to fold the strip just like so. So you've used 1/2 inch to attach the strip to the center front, and we folded 1/2 inch in to finish the raw edge for the strip. So now what is left is 1 inch. So we are going to fold the 1 inch to the center front. When we are attaching the strip, we attach it from the right side. So now we are going to turn the strip to the wrong side of our fabric, pin it, then top stitch to secure it just like so. So this is what you have after attaching the 2 strips to the front. Now place the strip, that's the 2 inches one, onto the 3 inches one just like so, and pin it together. So now we have our full front now. Measure and mark from the hem the length of the slit you want. In this case, I'll be using 9 inches for the slit, so I'll mark 9 inches for my slit. So now after pinning the center front together, place your back pattern onto the pattern, right sides together, and pin the shoulder. Then take it to the sewing machine and sew your shoulder seams using the seam allowance you added. Now we need to add our collar. So match the notch on your collar and the notch at the center back neck to place your collar and pin it to the center front just like so. I'll be using a technique called ditch sewing. So when I'm placing the collar, I'll place it at the right side, that's right side to right side, then pin it. Then I'll take it to the sewing machine, then sew on it. As you can see, one side of the collar will be longer. This is because of the extra 1 inch we added. So trim it to make sure that it is matching the length of the neck. Trim it and sew it to finish it so that it will match the neck. So after attaching your collar, this is what you will have. Go ahead and make notches and then trim the seam allowance to reduce bulk in the neckline. So after attaching the neckline, this is what you have. Push the seam allowance inward into the seam of the collar. Then make sure that you fold your collar to cover the seam for the front when you are attaching the collar to the neck. Take it to your sewing machine and ditch stitch. That's sew in the seam at the right side of your dress. This will sew the collar you have folded without creating a top stitch in the front. Now we need to work on the sleeve. Since this is a puffy sleeve, we have to gather the sleeve to the size of the armhole. So I'm going to use a gather stitch on my machine, then stitch from the notch lines, then gather it just like so. So I'll do that for both sleeves. Then I'll attach the sleeve to the armhole of the kurti. After joining the sleeve, place the two side panels together, right side facing each other. Pin and sew using the seam allowance you added. So in this case, I added ½ inch seam allowance to the side seam. So I'm going to use ½ inch to join the two side panels. That's the front and back panel. Repeat for the other side of the side seam of the kurti. If this video is helpful, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more pattern drafting and sewing tutorials. Share so that others can find the video. And again, are you going to make this dress? If you are, what fabric are you going to use? Let me know in the comment section. This is the side of the kurti after sewing the side seam. Pull your pocket towards the center front, then pin it, then use a short tack stitch to secure the pocket towards the center front. This stitch helps the pocket to stay flat at the center front. Do same for the other pockets too. Now our kurti is almost ready. If you want bottoms and bottom hole, this is the time for you to create your bottom holes at the center front. I'm not going to add bottom holes to this kurti. I'm just going to attach the center front panels together and top stitch it together. So now I'll measure from the hem the length of the slit I want and mark. Then from the collar, I'm leaving about 5 inches down from the neck to create a so that I'll be able to wear the kurti with ease. So I'm going to leave a space from the yap, then I'm going to leave the slits at the center front. So the rest, I'm going to top stitch the center front of the kurti from the slit mark to the neck mark. So now this is what I have. I'm going to attach bottoms to the center front just for decoration. Then go ahead and hem the hem of your kurti. So I'm going to use the 1 inch. That's I'm going to fold 1/2 inch first, then I'll fold 1/2 inch again to finish the hem of the dress, and our kurti is done. Thank you for watching to this stage. You are wonderful.